Now that you have learned how to write the first move of your research introduction, let us now proceed on how you can write the second move known as establishing a niche. Okay, so before we proceed with the steps on how you can write the move to or the second paragraph of your research introduction, let us first identify or define what do we mean by niche. Okay, so let's have the following discussion. So, niche, in the context of research, pertains to the potential of a study to develop new knowledge and understanding. So, meaning to say, establishing a niche in writing your research introductions means that you have to establish what is the potential of your study. How can it help in the development of new knowledge and understanding? So, in other words, establishing a niche provides the researcher the opportunity, okay? It provides the researcher the opportunity to present their research in order to contribute to the development of new knowledge and understanding. However, there is a question. Why do we need to establish our niche? Why is there a need for us to identify or let's say to showcase the potential of our study? Okay, there is a need for us to establish a niche because there is an existing research gap. And what do we mean by research gap? Okay, research gap class, it actually pertains to the missing information from the previous researches. Okay, take note class, pertains to the missing information from the previous researches. And such missing information from the previous researches means that the previous studies have their own weaknesses. Okay? They have their weaknesses. And if the study has weaknesses, it means that they lack further information on how to solve the existing problem or the rationale. Okay, again, class, we have to establish a niche so that we can, let's say, bridge the research gap. So we can address the research gap. And this research gap pertains to the missing information that highlights the weaknesses of the previous studies. Meaning to say, if the previous studies have their weaknesses, it lacks further investigation or information so that they can solve the rationale. Okay? So, meaning to say, class, there is a need for us to establish a niche in order to bridge the research gap. You must show that your study has a potential to supply the missing information of the previous researches. Okay? So this is the concern of Move 2, to provide an opportunity to fill in the research gap. Okay, so move 2 actually has 4 steps. Okay, you have 4 steps to follow in order for you to write the move 2 of the research introduction. And how to write, let's say, what are those steps so that we can write the move 2? Let us have the following example. Okay, so we have here the first example, or let's say the first step on how you can write the move to. We have, while Nagala et al. And Wasiyala claimed that antimicrobial agents like oregano and kapok extracts against black rot could have therapeutic potential, it lacks further investigation. Okay, so take note class of this part. It lacks further investigation. Okay, what does it suggest? What does it claim? What does this phrase claim? What does it mean? Okay, so this part claims that the previous researches of Nagala et al. And Wasiel et al. Must be further investigated. Okay, so the researcher here claims that the previous studies must be further investigated, meaning to say the researcher is trying to challenge the findings of the previous studies. Okay, and the previous studies are actually indicated by these citations. Okay, and how did the researcher challenge the findings of the previous studies? Okay. The researcher challenged the previous findings of the research study by presenting an opposing claim. And presenting an opposing claim, okay, will be known as counterclaiming. So this is the first step in writing the move to of the research introduction. So in counterclaiming, the researcher will challenge, refute, or disprove the findings of the previous researches by presenting an opposing claim or what we know as counterclaim. Okay? We present an opposing claim to disprove or let's say to challenge that the previous findings must be further investigated. Okay, so let's move on to the next step on how we write the move to. So notice here, class, okay, we have here the phrase, several studies did not consider the other possible symptoms of black rot among agricultural crops. Okay, so this statement, class, do you think it indicated an evidence for your counterclaim? Okay, so in the last step, you presented an opposing claim. And in this part, okay, this statement actually indicated an evidence that the previous researches, which is indicated by several studies, do not sufficiently address the existing problem. Okay? So therefore, class, this part indicates that the previous studies are considered to be incomplete. Okay? Why? Okay, a study is considered to be incomplete if it has missing information. Okay? So meaning to say, class, okay, if a study has a missing information, this will indicate the weakness of the previous studies. So, we need to say, class, there is a need for you to indicate a research gap. Okay? So that will be the main concern of step 2 of move 2. You have to indicate that there is a research gap. Okay? And how will you indicate a research gap? So you will have to demonstrate that the other previous researches did not sufficiently address the existing problem and they don't have sufficient evidence. Okay? So you must indicate here that the research problem, or let's say the previous research studies, are considered to be incomplete. Okay, so now that after you have pointed the weaknesses of the previous studies, you will have to make a suggestion. Okay, so remember, class, in step 1, you presented an opposing claim. In step 2, you indicated an evidence that the previous studies are considered to be incomplete. Now, if you see that the previous studies are incomplete, you will have to make a suggestion. So let's take a look with the next step on how you can present your suggestion. Okay, so notice here, class, that the researcher here pointed out that the previous researches lack findings, okay, they lack findings regarding the synergistic effect of the kapok and oregano. Okay, so the researcher here raised such questions. They asked such questions regarding the previous studies. Okay, and these questions are actually in a form of call for action or suggestions. But suggestions about what? So suggestions that there is a need for additional research. And this is the main concern of step 3 of move 2, which is known as question raising. Okay? So in question raising, class, the researcher will suggest, okay, and address that the things or concepts that the previous researches did not cover. Okay, and remember, class, that question raising is in a form of calling for action or call for suggestions. Okay, so now after you have made suggestions out of the research gap, you must now present your current research as a potential solution to such questions. Okay, So, for you to present your research has a potential to solve such questions, we have here this example. Hence, this current study will investigate this problem as it extends, okay, the previous researches. So take note, class, of this part. Extends the previous researches. So meaning to say, class, your study, or let's say this part, claims that your study will act as an extension of the previous researches so that it can supply the missing information. And take note, class, are citations needed for this part? Okay, so there are no citations needed for this part. Okay, so in this part, you will present your study as a useful extension of the previous researches. And this will be known as the step 4, known as continuing a tradition. So this part must present your study as a useful extension of the previous researches. So why useful extension? Okay, because, class, the current study you are writing claims that it can address and solve the existing problem. Okay, it can, let's say, it can fill in what was missing from the previous studies. Okay, that's why it's known as the useful extension. Okay, so combining these 4 steps, we can formulate our move 2 of our research introduction, and it will look like this. So it will form a single paragraph. Okay, so we have here step 1, counterclaiming, whereas the researcher will present a counterclaim or an opposing claim that the previous studies must be further investigated. Okay, in step 2, you will present evidences that the several studies did not consider, or let's say did not sufficiently address the existing problem. Okay, in step 3, you will have to point out suggestions by means of raising such questions. Okay, and in step 4, you must present your current study that it will serve as a useful extension of the previous researches. Okay, so this will be the second paragraph of your research introduction, known as establishing a niche. So for our next video presentation, we will now be discussing the third and last move of the research introduction.